All right, so let's talk about one of the most spectacular pop culture explosions we've seen in a long time. We're going to dive into the incredible story of how Japan's biggest street party, the legendary Shibuya Halloween, was born, absolutely boomed, and then, well, got completely shut down. So, yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? How did this happen? Because this isn't just about a party getting a little out of hand. We are going to unpack the entire wild ride of Shibuya's Halloween, from its pop culture-fueled rise to the sudden and pretty decisive crackdown that changed everything. Okay, first things first. To really get what happened in Shibuya, you have to understand that Halloween in Japan is a whole different animal. It's not some ancient tradition. It's a super modern cultural adaptation. And this is where you see the huge difference. In Japan, Halloween isn't about kids going door to door for candy. Actually knocking on a stranger's door to ask for stuff, that's often seen as a major inconvenience, or meiwaku, a really key cultural idea about not bothering other people. So the key thing here is that Halloween in Japan is pretty much an adults-only affair. It basically gave a perfect mainstream excuse and a single date on the calendar for Japan's already huge cosplay culture to just spill out onto the streets in a massive, massive way. So you gotta ask, right? How does a Western holiday with zero historical roots in Japan just blow up like this? Well, it wasn't some organic movement. It was really a perfect storm of smart marketing and a fan culture that was just ready and waiting. And you can literally see all the pieces falling into place right here. First, you have Tokyo Disneyland making the look of Halloween, the pumpkins and ghosts, cool for a mass audience. Then, organized events like the Kawasaki Parade proved a street party could actually work. And then, bam, camera phones and social media hit the scene and acted as rocket fuel, turning this visual spectacle into a nationwide craze. In all of this energy, all these trends, they all converged on one very specific, very famous spot, Tokyo's iconic Shibuya Scramble Crossing. Thing is, nobody planned it. It just happened there. And get this, at its height, the Shibuya Gathering became the biggest unofficial Halloween party in the world. We're talking a completely spontaneous street festival with crowds of over 70,000 people. Just insane. This quote from someone who was right there in the middle of it, it just nails the feeling. It wasn't some organized parade with a route. It was more like a spontaneous public catwalk. A huge, informal meetup where people came just to be there, to see and be seen and show off their incredible costume skills. But you know how these things go. As the crowds got bigger and bigger every single year, that amazing creative vibe, it started to short circuit. The city just couldn't handle it. The party was becoming a total logistical nightmare, and the atmosphere really started to shift. And then came October 28, 2018. This was it. This was the moment the chaos really boiled over. It was the year the party made headlines around the world, and not for good reasons. I mean, it just went completely off the rails. A mob of people, probably fueled by alcohol, literally flipped over a small truck in the street. On top of that, police arrested almost 20 people for sexual offenses, and there were fights, vandalism, and just mountains of garbage everywhere. The party had undeniably become a public safety crisis. So, of course, the city had to respond. And the mayor of Shibuya Ward, Ken Hasebe, did not hold back. He officially labeled the event Nuisance Halloween, basically sending a crystal clear message that the city's patience was gone. This wasn't a party anymore. It was a public disturbance. So they didn't just pull the plug overnight. The crackdown happened in stages. It started with temporary booze bans just for Halloween weekend. Then came the heavy police presence and barricades. And finally, in June 2024, and this was likely influenced by that tragic crowd crush in Seoul back in 2022, the city brought in a permanent, year-round ban on nighttime street drinking. That was the final nail in the coffin. So Shibuya is out. The party's over. But where does all that creative energy go? Does it just disappear? Well, no. The crackdown didn't kill the desire to celebrate. It just forced that spirit to evolve and find new places to go. This table really lays it all out, doesn't it? The whole story is right here. The celebration moved from that one massive, chaotic party in Shibuya to a much more spread out and controlled model. The age of the no-rules street party is over, and it's been replaced by organized, often ticketed, and way more family-friendly events all over the country. So yeah, the Halloween spirit didn't just vanish, it just found new homes. That wilder street party vibe, it's kind of migrated to places like Osaka's Dotonbori district. At the same time, you've got these big organized events like the Ikebukuro Cosplay Festival. In our world of viral trends and social media flash mobs, it shines a huge spotlight on that tension between spontaneous, joyful celebration and the city's need to keep people safe. It makes you ask, when a party gets too big, who gets to decide it's over?
And that, unfortunately, brings us to the tragic Halloween crowd crush that happened in 2022 in the Itaewon district of Seoul.
159. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many people, mostly kids in their teens and 20s, lost their lives that night. It was the deadliest disaster in South Korea in years.
You have to picture the scene, right? This night was supposed to be a massive party. It was the first Halloween since the pandemic began without any restrictions. So you had about 100,000 people just buzzing with excitement, pouring into this super popular nightlife district to finally celebrate.
So how on earth did this happen? That brings us to the anatomy of a crowd crush. And the most important thing to know right up front is that experts all agree. This was a preventable disaster.
It was really a perfect storm of terrible factors. The crush happened in this one narrow, sloped alley. At its tightest point, it was only about 10 feet wide. The crowd was just enormous, and because it wasn't an official ticketed event, there was no central organizer. And that meant no one had a real crowd control plan, even though we know that once you get more than about 8 people packed into a single square meter, things get critically dangerous fast.
And if you want to understand the lack of preparation, this slide, it says it all. On the very same night, there was a protest downtown with about 25,000 people. It had 6,500 police officers assigned to it. Meanwhile, Itaewon, with 4 times the crowd size, had just 137 officers on duty.
Okay, let's walk through the timeline, because this is where it gets truly heartbreaking. It shows this wasn't a sudden event. There were warnings. The first emergency call about dangerous crowding came in at 6:34 in the evening. That's nearly 4 hours before the crush even started. 10 more calls followed. Yet by 10:08 p.m., the crush was happening, and it would be hours before help could reach everyone.
So this wasn't something that came out of nowhere. There were warnings, which of course led a whole nation to search for answers, for some kind of accountability.
Right away, the official investigation kicked into high gear. Police raided city departments, and their conclusion was that a lack of safety measures and police errors caused the crush. In the end, 23 officials were charged with negligence. And just tragically, the pressure from it all led to the apparent suicide of at least one officer who was being investigated.
But for the public, for the families, this just wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. Protests erupted, people demanded the president resign, the government got slammed for calling it an accident instead of a disaster, and a lot of people felt the investigation just scapegoated low-level officials while protecting the people at the top. The families of the victims just kept fighting for real justice.
And this sign, held by a protester near the site, it captures everything. The anger, the heartbreak. It could have been prevented. The state was not there. For so many, this felt like a basic failure of the government to do its most important job, protect its people.
All right, so after all of this, what are the lessons? What can we possibly learn from such a tragedy to make sure our modern festivities are managed better?
Just look at the difference here. This is a classic case of reactive versus proactive. That same weekend in Tokyo, at the famous Shibuya crossing, another huge gathering spot, they were proactive. They had a massive security presence. They had officers on platforms, they call them DJ police, using speakers to direct people, forming human chains to guide the flow. It's a night and day difference from what happened in Seoul.
So let's break down the big takeaways here, the lessons for any city, really. First, even spontaneous, leaderless events need official safety planning. Period. Authorities have to monitor crowds and step in before a situation becomes critical. Simple things like making a narrow alley one way can literally save lives. And at the end of the day, while we all have a role to play, the ultimate responsibility for this stuff has to lie with the authorities.
And all of this really leaves us with one massive, crucial question. In a world where huge crowds can gather anywhere, anytime, often organized in a flash online, who is ultimately responsible for keeping us safe? Is it the city? The government? Or do we all share that burden?
It's a really important question we all need to think about.
All right, every Halloween, you hear the same thing, right? That dark story parents tell their kids, that chilling warning about the candy you get from strangers and what might be lurking inside. It's a fear that feels as old as trick-or-treating itself. But here's the thing, is any of it actually true? Or is it all just one big ghost story? Well, let's find out. I mean, check this out. This quote from the New York Times way back in 1970 just nails that anxiety perfectly. It gets right to that deep down fear that the nice old lady down the street could actually be, a monster in disguise. And this wasn't just some fringe worry. This was the New York Times presenting it as a real, legitimate danger. Okay, but what if I told you that for all that fear, it's just not real? There's the sociologist, Joel Best, who's been digging into this for over 30 years. And after going through every single supposed case, every rumor, every news report, his conclusion is just staggering. He found zero, absolutely zero substantiated reports of a stranger killing a child with a poisoned treat from trick-or-treating. Not one. The whole panic, it's a myth. But, and this is the important part, that myth didn't just appear out of thin air. It was born from one single horrifying crime that got twisted into something else entirely. So to really understand where this myth came from, we gotta go back to 1974. And we need to talk about a man named Ronald Clark O'Brien. He got a nickname, the man who killed Halloween. Yeah, his story. This is the one case everyone points to as proof that the fear is real. So on Halloween night, his 8-year-old son Timothy eats just one piece of candy from his bag, a giant pixie sticks. And within an hour, he was dead. The cause of death was potassium cyanide, an incredibly lethal poison. I mean, on the surface, this was it. This was every parent's absolute worst nightmare come to life. And the news, of course, spread like wildfire, and it cemented this idea of the Halloween sadist in everyone's mind. But then, the police investigation uncovered this horrifying twist. The poison, it didn't come from some random house. It wasn't the work of some faceless monster hiding in the neighborhood. No. The killer was with Timothy the entire night. It was his own father. And when you look at the timeline of that night, it just reveals this chilling, calculated plan. So O'Brien takes his own 2 kids and a couple of neighbor kids out trick-or-treating. Later on, he suddenly has 5 of these giant pixie sticks, and he claims he got them from a house that was dark, where nobody answered the door. So they get home, and Timothy eats his. He says it tastes bitter, so his dad gives him Kool-Aid to wash it down, which tragically just made the poison work faster. Within minutes, Timothy was violently sick, and by the time he got to the hospital, it was already too late. I mean, it's just an unthinkable act, right? So the immediate question was just, why? Why would he do this? As the police started digging into O'Brien's life, they stopped looking at strangers in the neighborhood and put the spotlight squarely on the supposedly grieving father. And, well, his story started to unravel. Fast. And the motive, well, as it so often is, it was money. Investigators found out that Ronald O'Brien was absolutely drowning in debt. We're talking the equivalent of over $500,000 today, just a massive amount of debt. And this wasn't some new thing for him either. His history showed a guy who just could not hold down a job. He'd gone through 21 different jobs in just 10 years, so you can see he was desperate. And, as the police would soon find out, he had a very dark plan to fix it. And this is where they found the real motive. In the months right before that Halloween, O'Brien had secretly taken out multiple life insurance policies on both of his kids. The total payout for his son Timothy's death, it would have been around $100,000, which was just about enough to solve all of his money problems. And from there, the evidence was just overwhelming. Police checked. Nobody on their trick-or-treating route was giving out those giant pixie sticks. The guy who lived in that dark house O'Brien mentioned, he was an air traffic controller, and he'd been at work the whole night. Then, O'Brien's coworkers came forward saying he'd been asking weird questions about cyanide. He even gave the poison candy to 4 other kids, including his own daughter, just to cover his tracks. And the final nail in the coffin? The very next morning, the morning after his son died, he was on the phone with the insurance company asking how to collect the money. So, he was caught and convicted. But the story doesn't end there. Not even close. The damage Ronald O'Brien did, it rippled out way beyond his own family. It fueled a national panic that, honestly, is still with us today. Okay, and this is so important to understand. O'Brien's crime had nothing to do with Halloween. It was just a convenient tool for his greed. But the public, the media, they all latched on to the method, not the motive. The story that stuck wasn't father murders son for insurance money. The story was child killed by poisoned Halloween candy. And that one little shift, it changed everything. You know, there's actually a name for this kind of thing in sociology. It's called a moral panic. It's basically when a whole society gets gripped by this widespread, often kind of irrational fear that some evil out there is threatening the community. The fear feels very real to people, but it's usually completely out of proportion to the actual danger. And for a moral panic to really catch on, you need a villain. And in this case, the villain, or what sociologists call the folk devil, was the Halloween sadist. This idea of a faceless, nameless monster lurking in the shadows, just waiting to hurt innocent kids. And that figure is so terrifying because it could be anyone, right? Your neighbor, that person down the street. It was a total phantom. But the O'Brien case made that phantom feel terrifyingly real. This whole process is actually so common, there's a term for it, the deviancy amplification spiral. And you can see exactly how it works here. First, there's a concern, poisoned candy. Then, that concern finds a target, a folk devil, these so-called sadists. Pretty soon, there's a consensus. Everyone agrees the threat is real and serious. Then the reaction gets completely blown out of proportion to the actual threat. I mean, you've heard the stories, right? Hospitals x-raying candy, sometimes even banning trick-or-treating. And here's the last, most important step. The panic itself eventually fades, but the fear remains. It just becomes a part of our culture. So, okay. If the Halloween sadist is a myth, does that mean Halloween is totally safe? Well, no, not at all. It just means we've been spending decades, literally decades, worrying about the wrong things. Think about it. All that energy we spend inspecting candy wrappers, throwing out homemade popcorn balls, it's been a massive distraction from the much more boring but statistically real dangers that are way more likely to cause harm on Halloween. I mean, just take a look at the actual data. The Consumer Product Safety Commission says that almost half of all Halloween-related injuries come from, wait for it, pumpkin carving. Yeah. Add to that falls from goofy costumes or just tripping in the dark, and poison candy from strangers? It's not even on the chart. It's a zero. A literal zero. But the scariest statistic, the one that really matters, has nothing to do with candy. The single biggest danger to a kid on Halloween is traffic. For young kids, between 4 and 8 years old, the risk of being killed in a pedestrian accident is 10 times higher on Halloween night than on any other night of the entire year. 10 times higher. So the difference here is just stark. On one side, you have the imaginary dangers we've all been taught to fear, the poison, the razor blades, the needles. And on the other side, you have the boring but real statistics, cars, falls, pumpkin carving knives. For 50 years, we've been terrified of a ghost while completely ignoring the real dangers that are right there in front of us. So when you really break it down, the story of poisoned Halloween candy isn't about random, faceless evil. It's the story of one man's terrible greed. It's a horrific family tragedy that got hijacked and twisted into an urban legend that's haunted us for half a century, shaping how we celebrate and what we choose to be afraid of. And that really leaves us with one last, kind of unsettling question, doesn't it? Why are we so much more afraid of the monster we invent than the dangers we can actually see?
You know, everyone thinks they know the story, right? A terrifying radio broadcast about a Martian invasion sends America into a complete and total panic. It's the legendary tale about the power of mass media. But what if I told you the story we all know isn't really the story at all? Okay, let's get into it.
So imagine waking up on Halloween morning back in 1938 and seeing this. This New York Times headline really set the stage for everything that followed. It painted this dramatic picture of a nation just gripped by fear, totally convinced that Martians were torching New Jersey. This right here was the birth of a legend.
So, what did this supposed panic actually look like? Well, the day after the broadcast, newspapers all over the country were just filled with these incredible, almost unbelievable stories of chaos and terror. I mean, the details in these reports are just wild. You've got stories of families running from imaginary gas attacks, switchboards from New York to Kansas City completely swamped, and people so convinced that they swore they could see the fires from the invasion. This was the narrative that took hold. A gullible nation completely and utterly fooled.
It's a pretty fair question, isn't it? How could something like this even happen? Well, the answer isn't just in the story itself, but in the revolutionary way it was told, by a 23-year-old kid who happened to be a creative genius, Orson Welles. So let's talk about the broadcast. Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater on the Air, they were already known for pushing the envelope. And for their version of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, they decided to try something that nobody had really done before, to frame a sci-fi story as if it were a live news event.
Wells just masterfully blurred the lines between fiction and reality. See, the show started off super normal, with some boring dance music. But then bam, a news flash. Then another. They brought in an on-scene reporter who sounded terrified and a respected astronomer. Every single step was designed to sound exactly like the radio news reports people were just getting used to, slowly cranking up the dial from, "Huh, that's weird," to, "Oh my God, we're all gonna die."
And here's the secret weapon, the absolute genius move. The actor who was playing that panicked reporter, he had spent hours listening to the raw, incredibly emotional broadcast of the Hindenburg disaster. So his stammering, breathless performance didn't just sound real, it tapped into a traumatic national memory that was still incredibly fresh in everyone's minds.
So you've got a brilliantly realistic show, and this tidal wave of sensational headlines. But this is where the story we all know takes a very sharp turn. What if the widespread panic wasn't the real event? What if the panic itself was the invention?
You know, in recent years, historians have started going back to the original sources, the letters, the data, and what they found challenges pretty much every part of the legend we've been told. Historian A. Brad Schwartz did something that was, remarkably simple. He just read the mail. He went through hundreds of letters sent to Wells and the radio network right after the show. And what he found was that the vast majority of them weren't from panicked people. Nope. They were from listeners who knew it was a play and were writing in to say how much they loved it.
And when you put the myth side by side with the reality, the gap is it's staggering. The so-called wave of mass hysteria was really more like a few pockets of confusion here and there. Researchers who tried to verify all those claims of suicides or people being treated for shock, they found almost nothing to back them up. The truth is, most people who heard the show either knew it was a drama from the start or figured it out pretty darn quick.
So this is the real mystery here, right? If the panic was mostly just a big exaggeration, who exaggerated it? And more importantly, why? Who actually benefited from making America believe it had totally lost its mind?
Well, the answer wasn't in outer space. It was in the newsrooms. See, back in 1938, a war was brewing, not with Martians, but between two different kinds of media.
To get what happened, you have to understand this idea of radio lash. Radio was the hot new thing. It was basically the internet of its day. It was fast, it was exciting, and it was stealing advertising dollars and eyeballs away from old-school newspapers. The newspaper industry was feeling the heat, and it was looking for a way to punch back.
And you don't have to guess their motive. This quote from the newspaper industry's own trade journal is basically the smoking gun. They were openly arguing that radio was this irresponsible, dangerous new medium that just couldn't be trusted with the serious job of delivering the news. So for them, the War of the Worlds broadcast wasn't a crisis, it was a golden opportunity. Newspapers jumped on the few scattered reports of confusion and blew them up into a full-blown national panic. Why? To prove to advertisers and to the government that radio was reckless and needed to be reined in. The Martian panic was a weapon in a media war.
Okay, so if the story was largely cooked up by a competing industry, why do we all still believe it, more than 80 years later?
Well, the simple answer is the myth was just a much better story. It taps right into our anxieties about being manipulated by what we see and hear. Plus, Orson Welles became this larger-than-life director, and the panic became his awesome origin story. And ironically, even CBS, the network that aired it, eventually leaned into the legend because, hey, it made them seem incredibly powerful.
And this is exactly why this story from 1938 feels so important right now. It's this powerful reminder that misinformation isn't always about the lie itself, but about who stands to gain when a certain story takes hold. It forces us to ask a question that's as relevant today as it was then. When we hear a story that confirms our worst fears, who exactly is benefiting from it?
And that's a wrap on Halloween week. Wow, what a journey it's been. Seriously, a huge thank you for coming along on this incredible ride with us. So let's do a quick recap of just how much ground we actually covered. I mean, look at this. We went from ancient history all the way to modern horror. We started right at the beginning, with its origins and why we get a kick out of being scared. Then we dove into horror movies, fan culture, and some seriously dark urban legends.
And we wrapped it up with the infamous real-life events tied to Halloween.
So, if there's one thing to take away from this whole week, what is it? Halloween is way more than one day. It's how we safely face our fears, together. We had so much fun putting this all together, and we really hope you did too. But now that Halloween week is over, what's next? Well, the next big thing kicks off tomorrow. That's right, our next full week-long theme is about to begin.
So make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss day one.
And we have one last thing to ask of you. Because this channel is a community, and we want you to help decide where we go next. There's a new poll live right now on our community tab. Just go to the tab, cast your vote, and help us pick our next big topic.
So again, thank you for making Halloween week so amazing.
We can't wait to show you what's next. We'll see you tomorrow.